Yeah, sure. Thank you. Actually, a cup of water would be better. Yeah. A cup of water. Thank you so much. What's the time, sir? Well, what? Yeah. Check. No. All right. So I guess we are live. So I'm going to get started. Welcome everyone to the history of epidemics in Jewish history. So it's an interesting class. I want to give a quick thank you. Chabad.org had an excellent article that I helped me prepare for this, and also I did research myself, trying to find all the different references to epidemics in Jewish history. Unfortunately, it's probably more of a common topic than we realize. living in the 21st century or the 20th century, or at least the 21st century, epidemics aren't necessarily a big topic until now. But in the past, they were. And in Jewish history also, they unfortunately had their place, as we will discuss tonight. Just on a lighter note, there's a if you've ever heard of the Yiddish insult "chalaria," that's actually what it actually means. Basically, a type of plague that was actually a very serious and deadly plague that plagued the world and the Jewish population in particular. So that's, I guess, one reference, and I guess you could say popular Jewish culture to an epidemic that's very common. You probably, many of you possibly heard of it. And just by way of example, again, epidemics were unfortunately a big part of world history and our history. So let us focus in on the Jewish history and the Jewish sources on epidemics. So, to the best of my knowledge, the first instance of a epidemic in our remembered recorded history is of the Plague of Pestilence in Egypt. So interestingly enough, it was not a plague. The first epidemic that we have recorded was not a plague of humans, but it was a plague for animals. This was in Egypt, and Moses had asked Pharaoh, "Let my people go," and Pharaoh had refused, and God was sending the plagues. So we had 4 plagues, and the 5th plague was the plague of pestilence. And in that plague, all the animals of the Egyptians died. So what's interesting about this plague was, first of all, it was only animals. It was also clearly a supernatural occurrence. It was not a wasn't a medical. There was no medical explanation for this, and also it only targeted Egyptian animals. And on top of that, even from the Egyptian animals, Moses warned that there's going to be a plague, and any Egyptian who took their animals inside, and I guess in that way removed them from the rest of the flock, those animals were protected. So even then, although it was obviously quite supernatural, obviously, it only struck the Egyptian flock, but even then we already seen this theme of that when there's an epidemic, if you want to be protected, you have to get away from it. And therefore the Egyptians who listened to Moses' warning and took their animals away from the flocks that were out herding, pasturing, and brought them indoors, actually had their animals saved. So even then, when it was a divine epidemic, already then we're seeing that the best prevention from an epidemic is to get away from everyone else or all the other animals in the case of the epidemic. Okay, so that was to the best of my knowledge, the first instance of an epidemic in the Torah. The next is not so well known. By the way, is everyone is the technical aspect of this working? Yeah. Okay. So the next is not so well known, but it's there, and it happened not too long after the plague of the pestilence, and this was the plague that happened in Israel. When was this? It's actually not recorded explicitly in the Bible. If you look in the Torah, it doesn't record what I'm about to say. But in the commentators of the Torah, it's recorded, and it's alluded to in the Torah. What plague was this? So after the Jewish people left Egypt, they were in the desert, and they were getting ready to enter Israel. And they sent out scouts to check out what is actually going on in Israel. What is Israel like? So the scouts went out, and they arrived. Now, these scouts were spies, because at the time there was the Canaanites living in Israel. And obviously, if you sent 2 or 12 people from a group who were going to check out Israel, and they were planning on actually going back to the Jewish people and telling them how to conquer, how the land is like and how to conquer it, obviously these 12 spies are not going to be very well loved by the people they're scouting out. They're doing enemy or they're doing a reconnaissance against the people. So they were in very great. These 12 spies were in very great danger of being caught and killed by the inhabitants of Canaan. So God made a miracle for these spies, and upon their arrival in Israel, a tremendous amount of Canaanites started dying. So the Canaanites were so preoccupied with burying their dead that they weren't able to be on lookout and catch the spies. So this was the second instance that I'm aware of a plague happening in the Torah. Now, interestingly, what happened was, instead of the spies appreciating this miracle that God performed for them, instead of doing that, the spies turned it around and used this as a criticism of Israel. And they said the land that God is giving us is a terrible land and everyone's always dying there. It's an epidemic land. So here we have a second instance of epidemics in the Torah, where when the spies went to Israel, there was an epidemic going on in the land. Now, the third instance happens later on, much later on in Jewish history, and it's a famous account. What is the story? After the Jews entered Israel and they lived they had their own land and their own government for many hundreds of years, and eventually they appointed a king to rule over them, and that king was succeeded by the great King David. And King David had a long and turbulent, but also very great reign over the Jewish people. But towards the end of his reign, he made a number of mistakes. And one of them was he decided to do a census. It's funny because this was, right now we're going through, unfortunately, an epidemic, and it's also the census. And interestingly enough, when King David decided to do a census of the Jewish people, it resulted in an epidemic. How so? Because the Torah, the God and the Torah did not want that the Jewish people should be counted. That God didn't want it. It's a known thing that a blessing rests on what's not seen. And when you count something and you make it official, it's not good for blessings. It's like you're showing it off. And when you show something off, you can cause there to be what's called an evil eye. It's like, when you're ostentatious and everyone's looking at you and going, oh, there you have all of this and all of that, and you're sort of showing off all the things you have. When you cause people to look at you and sort of stick it in people's faces, it causes negative forces. So too, when you count something, it could cause people to, it's like showing it off, showing how much I have. So it causes negative things to happen. So therefore, God never wanted that the Jewish people should be counted. And actually, to this day, you're not supposed to count Jewish people. You're not supposed to go, when you're in a group and you have to count for a minyan, let's say. You shouldn't go 1, 2, 3, 4, because it's considered, again, you're sort of, showing off how many people you have, and that causes an evil eye. So either way, King David was not supposed to count the Jewish people, but he went ahead and did it anyways. And as a result, God caused a plague to come onto the Jewish people. And there was a tremendous amount of death. I think there was 70,000. Sorry, there was a 3-month plague, and 70,000 people died. 70,000. It was a horrible, horrible plague. And at that point, King David prayed to God and begged God for mercy. And he said, why are the people suffering? I should be punished. It was my idea to count the people. And at the end, God told King David to go buy the site of the temple. And King David he went and purchased the Temple Mount and brought sacrifices to God upon there. and after David bought the Temple Mount and brought sacrifices to God, the plague stopped. And this was another instance of a plague in the Torah. Actually, I missed one, so let's go back. Let's back up a couple hundred years, and to shortly after, this is a fourth instance of plagues in the Torah. This is also a famous instance, and this happened again. We're going to back up from King David a few hundred years, and we're going to go back to the Jewish people in the desert. And this was at the end of the 40 years in the desert, and the Jewish people were about to enter into Israel, and everything was looking good. And suddenly, the evil Bilam, who was a sorcerer, he was advising the Midianite people, who were a people that lived in Jordan, how to hurt the Jewish people. Initially, Bilam tried to curse the Jewish people. And if we know what happened, it didn't work out. God did not allow Bilam to curse the Jewish people, and he turned his curses into blessings. But then Bilam, he didn't give up. He kept on trying to hurt the Jewish people. So what he did was, they couldn't curse them. So instead, he decided to make them sin. How did he do that? He went and he got the people of Midian to set up a big bazaar, a big marketplace. And in the marketplace, there was all these incredible items. And all the Jewish people went to the marketplace to check it out, to see what they have in the mall, to see what they have in this incredible market, to see what's going on. So the Jewish people, they went to the marketplace, and they said they have all these good bargains, and they got all excited. But then when they went over to all the different stalls in the market, it was actually a trap to entice them to sin. And what happened was, once they were involved in buying in the marketplace, they had the daughters of Midian invited these Jewish men to sit down for a meal with them, and to act promiscuously with them, and to worship the idols of Midian. And it was a tremendous breaking of the Jewish morale for these men to be acting promiscuously with the daughters of Midian and to be worshiping the Midianite idols. And ultimately, there was a prince, one of the 12 princes of Israel. He also engaged in sin with a Midianite woman. And as punishment from this, God sent a plague that wiped out 24,000 Jews. So it was a tremendous plague. And I'm sorry, give me just half a second. Yeah, and there's a plague that wiped out 24,000 of the Jewish people. It was actually, now that we're on the topic of plagues wiping out the Jewish people in the desert. Give me a second. I missed a few more. I'm sorry, I got confused. Yeah. There was actually another instance of a plague in the desert. It was after the rebellion. Basically, there was a rebellion against Moses' leadership in the desert. And Moses was the leader of the Jewish people, and he was also their king, actually. And there was a man by the name of Korach. And this man by the name of Korach, he led a rebellion against Moshe. And he said, why should Moshe get to be the king? Why should he be greater than everyone else? So he was ultimately punished by God. He was actually swallowed up by the ground. But in the aftermath of this insurrection, and the people sort of, they stood by and even abetted this insurrection, there was actually another plague that smote the Jewish people. And the way this plague was stopped was that Aaron, the high priest, took incense and he burnt a pan of incense. And this incense served as a way to stopping God's wrath and stopping the plague. So here we have, so far, 5 instances of plagues in the Torah. So we have the plague of the pestilence, the plague in the Canaanites when the spies went to check out Israel. We have the plague that happened as a punishment for the Jewish people for rebelling against Moses' authority with Korach. We have the plague that happened as a result of the Jewish people acting promiscuously with the Midianites. We have the plague that happened with King David when he counted the Jewish people. So here we have 5 instances of plagues in the Torah. There's actually, so these are 5 instances of plagues in the Torah. It could be there's more, but these are 5 famous instances. Next, let's move forward in history to the Gemara, the Talmud. So the Talmud actually has an interesting reference to infectious disease. The Talmud actually mentions that there's this disease called Rodham, Rathan, and I guess you would transliterate it. And it's not a particularly desirable disease, no diseases, but especially not this one. The symptoms of this disease are runny eyes, runny nose, runny mouth, and flies swarming around the person, or mosquitoes swarming around the person. So it doesn't sound particularly pleasant. And Rabbi Yochanan said they should be very careful about the insects swarming around this person who has Rodham. Because apparently the Talmud writes that the insects could pass the disease, the insects could pass the disease from one person to the next. And Rabbi Zera, he wrote that's even worse. He said, make sure that you're not standing near a person who has this disease, that the wind shouldn't blow on both of you, because the wind could actually blow the disease from one person to the next. It was actually airborne. And then those other rabbis in Israel said, Rav Ami and Rav Asi said that you shouldn't even eat food that comes from the eggs, that comes from the area where these people were. So I guess this disease can be passed through food contamination. That's how terrible it was. But then the Talmud ends off. There was a rabbi, and his name was Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. And he, hello? Hello? Did something change? Did something change?
No, I'm listening to your class.
Okay, good. So it was a rabbi, and his name was Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. And he would go next to the people who were suffering from this disease, and he would learn Torah next to them. So basically, he was so selfless that he was willing to be in the quarters of these people suffering from this disease in order to teach them Torah and to comfort them. And the Talmud says that as a reward for this, he was actually able to escape death itself. When his time came to die, he managed to basically managed to die without being killed. What this means is it's similar to Elijah the prophet. He ascended alive to heaven. So this Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi was so devoted and so selfless that he was willing to himself go to care for these sick people who other rabbis were running away from. They didn't want to get infected. So as a reward for his selflessness, he actually never died. Like Elijah the prophet, he was able to leave this world without being killed. So this was the Talmud talking about infectious disease. Now we're going to fast forward a bit more to the time of the Rambam. Now I have to give a disclaimer that what I'm about to say, I was not able to find a first-hand source for it, but I saw it in a video put together by a historian whose name was Rabbi Beryl Wine. So I have to assume that if he included this in a video he produced, there is a historical source. Again, I wasn't able to find it, but he's an historian. He conveys, he shows what I'm about to tell you in a video. So I assume that is historical. And Rabbi Beryl, in this video of Rabbi Beryl Wine, it portrays how Maimonides, the Rambam, was a great physician, and that's a fact, who lived in the year 1100 or late 1100, and he was a great physician. He was actually a physician for Salah ad-Din, who was a great Muslim conqueror. And the Rambam was his physician in Egypt. And besides from being a physician, he was a great rabbi and communal leader. And one of his activities that he did, or his, you could say, campaigns, if you will, that he had as a communal leader, was to fight the heresy of the Karaites. The Karaites were a Jewish sect who rejected belief in the Talmud. So they rejected belief in the Talmud, and they had a number of different beliefs that did not fit with the Orthodox Rabbinic Judaism. And one of their beliefs was that they did not believe in doctors. There's people to this day who have similar beliefs. They basically said if God gives an illness, then it's God's will, and therefore we should not take any health advice or precautions. That's solely up to God. And that was their belief. And the Rambam fought against it. The Torah teaches that the doctor is given permission to heal. So it's not Jewish it's not the Jewish belief to say that we don't believe in any medical advice and any doctors. The Torah teaches us to listen to doctors. But the Karaites did not believe in it. And even in those times, part of medical advice was that you had to practice, you have to have proper sanitary systems. Actually, interesting, I forgot to mention this, but now it's coming back to me. The Torah itself prescribes steps to prevent the spread of infection and disease. The spread of diseases. How does the Torah do this? The Torah writes that it's a mitzvah in the Torah and a sin not to listen. That at the time of war, when the soldiers were to go to the bathroom, they were not allowed to just go to the bathroom and leave the excrement exposed. It was a sin to do that. They had to bury the excrement, and this is the Torah writes. And clearly, this is one of the reasons for this is a precaution to prevent diseases from spreading throughout the camp. So here you already have in the Torah 3,000 years ago sanitary health precautions to prevent the spread of diseases. But either way, fast forward to the time of the Rambam, the Karaites didn't believe in all this. They didn't believe in all these precautions against diseases, all this medical advice. And the Rambam fought very strongly that people should, in fact, be careful from diseases and dispose of waste in a sanitary manner. But they didn't listen to him. And in the city that Rambam lived, there was an epidemic that broke out. And the Rambam's own wife and children passed away in this epidemic. So here we have an example of an epidemic brought on by people not living in a sanitary way. Let's fast forward a bit to the 1300s. And during the 1300s, there was the famous Black Death that killed off a large portion of the European Asian population. The Euro-Asian, it's called population. I guess Europe, Europe as we know it today. I don't have off the top of my head the exact number, but a large percentage of the entire population died in an epidemic known as the Black Death. And it's very famous that the Jewish mortality rates were much lower. And the reason given for this scientifically was because we know that whenever we wash our hands before eating bread, we have to wash our hands. And what's more, every morning when we wake up, we also have to wash our hands. And what's more, before we pray, we also have to wash our hands. So because within the Jewish religion is already built in all these sanitary, and also it's mandated that many times we have to go to a mikvah bath. So now, because already built into the Jewish religion, we have all these sanitary precautions. Now, to be fair, the reason why we wash our hands is for spiritual reasons, but nevertheless, there's physical benefits from it. And because we had all these sanitary precautions built into Judaism, that's why modern historians and scientists say that the Jewish people had a much lower mortality rate. But it's very famously, because the people at the time didn't understand this, and they saw the Jewish people were dying at much lower rates, they accused the Jewish people. They said this must be some sort of conspiracy, and they accused the Jewish people of poisoning the wells to kill. And they said that's the cause of the Black Plague. And actually, as a result of this, those tremendous persecutions and killings of Jews, to the extent that after this plague, the Jewish community of Germany was mostly, if not entirely, wiped out. Because again, there was this plague that killed a large amount of the general population, and the Jewish people were less affected. But because the Jewish people were less affected, the general population accused the Jews of spreading some sort of poison to kill everyone, and the resulting murders and persecutions of the Jewish people nearly, if not entirely, wiped out the Jewish community of Germany. Next, move forward to the Spanish expulsion. And the Jewish people lived in Spain for a very, very long time, possibly 1,500 years, or many, many hundreds of years. And it was a golden age. The Jewish people really had, there was a tremendous flourishing of everything Jewish in Spain. And finally, in the year 1492, interestingly, the same year that Columbus set sail for America, the Queen Isabella, decreed that all the Jews had to either give up their Judaism or leave Spain. And the majority, or a tremendous portion of the Jewish people, did not agree to give up their Judaism and left Spain and were forced to flee to the neighboring Portugal. And during this upheaval of the removal of the entire, or a huge portion of the Jewish population, a tremendous epidemic broke out, and there was tremendous death within this Jewish community that was already being moved and being forced to flee. And there was tremendous death going on within this Jewish community from an epidemic that they were struck with. So again, here we have another instance of epidemics in Jewish history. Now, what I'm about to say, the next instance is actually not well known at all. I had never heard of it, but in researching for this class, I discovered it, and it's very fascinating. In the year 1733, there was a colony, a British colony, established in or near Charlestown. I got Charlestown wrong, but I believe it was Charlestown. Either way, there was a British colony established in America, in South Carolina. And there was a whole group of British people, colonists, who came to establish this colony. And shortly after they arrived, there was an epidemic. And around that same time, there was a small group, a number of families of Jews who arrived in this colony. And what happened was that the Jews actually, in this group of Jews, there was a doctor who was very helpful to help cure and treat this epidemic. But also, what's very interesting was that the Jews did not suffer from this epidemic nearly as much as the general population. So modern day historians write that why is this so? And they say because the Jews came after the original colonists, a year or two after the original colonists. And therefore, the Jews had already lived through this epidemic when it went around England. So they're already immunized to this epidemic because they had already suffered through it with the rest of the English population. Then this epidemic crossed the ocean and arrived in the colony and ravaged the colony. But because the Jews had already suffered this epidemic with the rest of the English people on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, when this epidemic struck this colony in South Carolina, the Jews didn't really suffer from it at such a high rate. Their death rate was much lower. So here's another instance of epidemics in the Jewish people. Now, I got ahead of myself. I'm going to have to back up to the time of the Talmud and quote an interesting passage. Basically, there's a passage that says that if you have a couple and one of the couple decides, I want to move. So the Talmud says that anyone's allowed to go wherever they want, but if one member of the couple says, I want to move and I want to change areas, and the other spouse says, no, I don't want to change areas. So the Talmud says that if one member of the couple says they're living in the country, in the country, and they say, I want to move to the city, and the other member of the couple, another spouse says, no, I don't want to move to the city, I want to stay in the country. So the Talmud says if the spouse who wants to move to the city insists on their plans and moves to the city, then they cannot force the other spouse to move to the city, and they are considered basically at fault in this divorce. And the Talmud writes, why would they be at fault for wanting to move to a city? What could you possibly want in a city over the country? I mean, why are they considered like they ruined the marriage by asking to go to the city? Seemingly, any normal person should want to go to the city because there's so much more happening in the city. So the Talmud writes that there's certain advantages to living in the country. Now, the Talmud does not enumerate what those advantages are, and I did not see this in any of the commentators, but I think it's safe to say that one of the advantages that the Talmud was thinking of was the fact that cities must have been a lot more diseases in the city, and living in the country must have been a lot more healthy. And I think it's safe to say that's what the Talmud meant. That basically one spouse cannot force the other spouse to move to a city, even though they could say, but there's so much going on in the city, but the other spouse would say, that might be true, but I don't want to deal with all the diseases that were in cities. So this is another instance, again, of problems of epidemics in Jewish law. Okay, either way, sorry, I skipped that one. Let us move again forward to the 17th century. Sorry, the 18th century, to the 1700s. There was a great Jewish sage, and his name was Chida, and he lived in Israel. And at that time, the Jewish community in Israel was impoverished and was supported by donations from the Jews who lived outside of Israel. And the custom was that they were, from time to time, send a rabbi to go collect money from the Jewish populations around the world to support the Jews living in Israel. So this rabbi sent on this mission, his name was the Chidah, and he left Israel and he arrived in Italy in the mid 1700s. Now, what happened was when he arrived in Italy, not unlike today, the people of Italy were very nervous. Maybe he was bringing disease from abroad. So they forced this rabbi to go into quarantine for 40 days. And during his quarantine, he actually wrote a very famous book about Jewish history. To this day is a very authoritative book on Jewish history that he actually wrote during his quarantine time when he arrived from Israel to Italy. Let's move forward a bit. For just a few more instances of epidemics in the Jewish history. It was in the 1830s, and there was a epidemic going on in the area of I guess would be modern day. It's Austro-Hungary. It was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Central Europe. And there was an epidemic going on. So there was a great sage, and his name was Rabbi Akiva Eger. And he decreed that in order to fight this epidemic, they could have no more than 15 people come to pray at the same time in the synagogue. I guess, as today, they would have a time of prayer, and the whole community would come and they would pray. And there could be hundreds of people there. So the rabbi said, no, this is dangerous. We cannot have so many people congregated in one place. What we must do is break the prayer service up into small amounts of only 15 people. So we have to do the prayer service in shifts. It's interesting. I guess he did not entirely close down all the prayer service like we're doing now, but what he did was he broke up the prayer service into shifts of 15 people. He broke down this prayer service into shifts of 15 people. And he asked that the police should enforce this edict, and if anyone should come more than 50 people, the police should force them to break up the group. And after this epidemic passed, he was actually given a reward by the government for his leadership in fighting this epidemic. Let's move forward about 10 years to the 1840s. And there was a cholera epidemic going on in Europe again. This was a very common epidemic. It's actually little known. I just read this. Maybe it's well known, but I just found this out that 3 U.S. presidents, and if it's not 3, it's close to 3, died in this cholera epidemic that was ravaging the world at that time. And if I'm not exactly right on if it was which epidemic it was, or if it was 2 or not 3, I could be wrong, but I believe that during this time there was 3 U.S. presidents who died, from this epidemic. And if I'm wrong, I apologize about that detail about the 3 U.S. presidents. But either way, there's a terrible cholera epidemic ravaging the world, and it was also ravaging the Jewish community in Europe. And there was a rabbi, and his name was Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. He was a very great rabbi. And it was coming Yom Kippur. And many of the Jews wanted to fast, like they always do. But Rabbi Yisrael Salanter said that at the time of this epidemic, it's very important that we maintain our strength. We shouldn't become weak and become more susceptible to the disease. So therefore, everyone has to eat on Yom Kippur to keep up their strength, so they shouldn't catch the disease. And according to some accounts, the rabbi himself publicly took food and ate it on Yom Kippur in order to show everyone that you have to eat food on Yom Kippur that year in order to fight off this in order to they shouldn't succumb to the cholera epidemic. Now, what's interesting is in Jewish historical books written shortly after, a couple of decades later, and at that time when these books were written, cholera was still a problem, or was just recently not gotten over, but it was still current events. And the Jewish books wrote that many studies had shown that in many instances the Jewish people had a lower death rate from the cholera epidemic. Now, this wasn't always true. This history book writes there were some times when the Jews had high death rates, but typically, in many studies at the time, it was found the Jewish people had lower death rates from the cholera epidemic. And the reason for this given was, in this history book, was because the Jewish people had a lower instances of alcoholism. And one of the things that made a human being susceptible to this disease of cholera, this epidemic of cholera, was being an alcoholic. And because the Jewish people had a lower alcoholism rate, so therefore they also had a lower death rate from cholera. Just an interesting side note. And lastly, there was, I'll end off with this, there was an instance of a typhus outbreak. And this was also, typhus is a very, a disease that affected, over a long period of time, many different populations. But there was a typhus outbreak in Yekaterinoslav in southern Ukraine around World War I. And the Rebbe, who was at that time was a young man and a great scholar who would spend all of his time engrossed in his studies, the Rebbe took time off to stop studying and threw himself into the relief effort, caring for the patients who were suffering from this typhus epidemic. And the result of his efforts to help the ill suffering from this epidemic, the Rebbe himself caught the disease, and himself got very, very sick from this typhus. And obviously, the Rebbe did survive it, but he got very, very sick from catching the disease as when he was aiding others suffering from it. So here is I don't know if it's, I guess we'll end off with that. I don't know if I'm sure there are many other instances of epidemics in Jewish history, but I tried to give quite a good picture and overview of the history of epidemics in Jewish history. Thank you very, very much, everyone, for joining us. Tomorrow we have 2 wonderful classes at 12. My mother's Rosh Chodesh group is open. I'm Esther Kaltmann. Her Rosh Chodesh group is open to everyone via Zoom. And then at 7:30, my brother Shia will be giving a class on the bear with me. A class on a Jewish mysticism. Thank you very, very much, and all the best.